The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Jim Tankersley on the untold story of America's middle class and why it matters now. Dr. Cecilia Martinez on the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, and Bill Press with his take on Bob Woodward's latest book, Rage. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Jim Tankersley's newest book reveals the crucial role women and minorities played in building the post-war middle class. He says it's an untold story that offers an essential roadmap to reviving the golden era of America's middle class by making it possible again for all workers to reach their full potential. And we say hello to Jim Tankersley, covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times. He's the author, most recently, of The Riches of This Land, the untold true story of America's middle class. Jim Tankersley, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Part of this book is retelling the rise of the middle class, and we're largely talking about the 70s. What do we get wrong about that story?
Well, so I think we get wrong in the story goes all the way back to World War II. I think that the story that, I grew up hearing and that maybe a lot of your listeners grew up hearing was a very Leave It to Beaver story. The American middle class booms in the 50s and 60s and 70s as, white suburban dads come home from their jobs with new cars in the driveway. People can buy houses. Those things happened. But the story of the middle class really is a story of expanding opportunity for people who aren't white guys coming home from their white collar jobs. It's the story of women. It's the story of black men. It's the story of immigrants. It's a story of America, which had for far too long walled off opportunity to enormous groups of people, everyone who wasn't basically an elite white guy, finally tearing down some of those barriers. And when those barriers came down and talented people were able to get into jobs they never before had access to, crazy thing happened, which was the economy grew faster and everyone did better. And that was actually the driver of the great middle class boom of the post-war era. And I think a similar type of tearing down of the walls could unleash another boom again.
What's happened to these advances for women and people of color in the economy? Have the doors stayed open?
Well, I think in a lot of ways they've started to swing shut again. And some of that is, racism and sexism are still very real and very prevalent, unfortunately, in our country. In some cases, things got worse in the 80s. Mass incarceration certainly was a real blow to the economic fortunes of black men in particular. And then also the economy has just changed and policy has not kept up. And that has created some barriers too. If we think about the share of women who work in this country has, was steadily rising for a long time, but it plateaued and went backwards in recent years. Even before this crisis. And the reason that we saw that in the mid 2000s, in part, is because we didn't have good childcare options for a lot of working women. And so they were forced to make these choices that, for social reasons and otherwise, working men very rarely have to make. And that is an institutional barrier to women getting ahead. So some of it is policy challenges. Some of it is our own lingering institutions that continue to favor white men, and some of it is just plain and simple discrimination.
Yeah. Given how important the workers you're writing about are to the economy, what would be the reason not to finish the job and create a fully inclusive economy?
Well, I think there's two big reasons. One is that people in power don't like to give it up, and that what we've seen over time is that the elite men really who run the country have resisted in a lot of cases progress, all the way along the lines, and have gotten impatient and said, well, gee, we did civil rights, 10 years ago? That should be enough, right? When it clearly wasn't. But the second reason is that those men have sold a lie to America's workers, to the white workers in particular. And there are a large group of American workers who believe that people who don't look like them are threats to them. That immigrants or black workers or women are coming to take the jobs of white men in the industrial Midwest and elsewhere. And what the research shows is that's not true. That actually, when women and men of color and immigrants get ahead, everybody gets ahead, including working class white men. But it's a very politically advantageous story to tell. It's a story as old as the Republic, and that has been used quite effectively. And I think we live in a country where that is being deployed today.
You do write about Donald Trump in the book. And one of the points you make is that in selling himself to the so-called forgotten Americans, he perpetuates the myth that people of color and women are a threat to their jobs, much like what you just alluded to. What has been the price of this campaign?
Well, I think that the big price is that Donald Trump has taken some policy actions that have not done what he said they would do. I guess is the easy way to put it. I in my career as an economics reporter, I've spent a lot of time out with factory workers and other working class people around the country. I lived and worked in Ohio in the mid 2000s and talked to a lot of the types of folks who really believed that Donald Trump was going to make good on his promises to bring these jobs back, that tariffs and tax cuts were going to create this whooshing of jobs back to America, to paraphrase and reverse Ross Perot. But it hasn't happened. The numbers just don't lie. There has not been a surge in reshoring of jobs under Trump. The economy has not grown 4 or 5 or 6% a year like he promised. He didn't pay off the entire, federal debt like he said he would. And middle class people have done, until the pandemic, they did pretty well, but only the sort of pretty well you would expect at the end of a long expansion, and basically as well as they were doing in the final years of the Obama economy. So there has not been this transformational change brought to the economy by the president's policies that you can see in any economic evidence. And so that's the cost of pursuing them, is that he said he had a prescription that would work, and it has not delivered the results he said that it would.
We're speaking with Jim Tankersley, covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times, also the author most recently of The Riches of This Land, the untold true story of America's middle class. Jim, what kind of policies do we need now to rebuild our middle class?
Well, I think we need a lot of things, and one of the things that I think is really important to stress here is that there's not actually a single ideology that gets you to where history says we need to go as a country. You can be someone who really believes in the power of free markets and individual liberty, and you could go looking for policies that tear down the impediments that we throw up, whether it's inside companies or inside government mandates. That keep people from getting ahead, things like occupational licensing, and certainly things like mass incarceration, which the president, I think, gets real credit for signing a bill that attempts to start addressing. But you can also go the other way and say, that a much more robust system of government subsidized or supplied childcare would do a lot toward boosting female labor force participation and getting really talented women, to deploy their full talents in the workforce. But I actually have my really non-pat answer to this is that the biggest change we need is attitudinal. That the country needs to just sort of decide we are all going to commit to finishing the job of equality, and that if we can really tear down institutionalized racism and sexism, we're all going to get ahead. And that's not an easy that's not a 3-point plan. Oh, let's end racism and sexism. It is the great work that so many Americans have struggled for their entire lives. But it's just really important, and I think someone needs to say that it is an economic strategy as much as it is a justice strategy for us to commit ourselves again as a nation to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, looking at the political landscape and a Congress that can't seem to find the bipartisanship to address our most urgent needs. Are you at all optimistic that these kinds of changes can happen?
Well, I'm a professional reporter, so I'm by nature pessimistic about the ability of politicians to do anything. But I'm also someone who has spent enough time around people to and politics to recognize moments when there seems to be an important shift in the country. And I would say that has really, one such shift in just this summer has given me real hope. The protest movements for racial equality across America have absolutely driven and coincided with a marked shift in white Americans in particular reckoning with racism and its legacies and wanting to do something about it. And you have to start somewhere, but it gives me hope that a growing and overwhelming now number of Americans want to start again and try to start finishing the work of civil rights. And so it's too late in coming, and certainly there's lots of reasons to worry that it may not translate into the sort of policies that would be most helpful. But it's a start, and it is a place for hope. And this is a hopeful book, and I'm at my core an optimistic person, despite being a cynical reporter. So I choose to find the hope in that and run with it.
That was a very hopeful message from a cynical reporter, I will say. So that's great, and I understand the root in pessimism. The last chapter of your book is about being a journalist in this historical moment, and I can't imagine that you ever imagined you would be covering a political and economic climate such as we're living now. Has it changed the way you do your job?
It has. I had finished the book, and then the pandemic hit, and so I went in and rewrote huge portions of it. And I confess that I don't actually remember where they all ended up, whether it's the last chapter or sprinkled through the last chapters. But what I say in there is that we're now living through the second once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis of our lifetimes, which is, crazy. That can't help but change your job. I've been a full-time economics reporter for about a decade, and to have seen two of these is just wild. It is harder for me as someone who both lives in the minutia of spreadsheets and economic research, but also very much relies on human storytelling to convey economic messages and to help people understand how the world around them is changing, and to learn myself. I mean, the book is filled with stories of workers who I've met in my time as a reporter who have taught me what the progress in the economy really looks like. And it's harder to get out and meet those people and tell those stories when we're socially distancing, during times of quarantine. It's definitely changed how I do my job, and I regret to say that it's made it much harder to get just everyday workers across America into my pieces to the degree that I want. It's okay to talk to them on the phone. It's so much better to meet them in person, and that's been hard. But I think that's something every reporter is struggling with, and that every person in America is struggling with as we cope with the social clamping down that this pandemic has brought us.
Yeah, absolutely. The name of the book, The Riches of This Land, The Untold True Story of America's Middle Class. The author, Jim Tankersley, who covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jim, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and do it again soon.
I would love to. It was really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a national climate policy agenda that embraces racial equity and economic justice. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
For millions of people around the globe, especially young people, the pressing issue of our time is this: the world is on fire. On fire with climate change, creating a new and intensifying norm of deadly weather extremes that make a dystopian future a distinct possibility. Constant wildfires, rising seas, desertification, global crop failures, widespread hunger, water shortages, etc. Luckily, we are a sentient species with the scientific ability to know that the chief cause of this global destruction is not angry gods, but us, specifically humankind's massive extraction and burning of oil, gas, coal, and other fossil fuels. So there's a rising chorus of people shouting, "Fire!" And sure enough, our national government is rushing to the scene to put it out. Unfortunately, our president and his crew of right-wing fire breathers in Congress are not directing the government's hoses at the corporate extractors, but at us, the people, scientists, environmentalists, and other activists who've dared to point to the flames and call for global action to stop the conflagration. They seem to think the problem will go away if they can make the protesters go away. Worse, they're fanning the flames by turning the EPA into the PPA, the Polluters Protection Agency. They're slashing dozens of public restraints on the polluters while also opening up our oceans and wilderness areas to their polluting greed and stalling the rational shift to a green energy future. This is Jim Hightower saying the good news is that the people are revolting, in the very best sense of that term, revolting against our corrupt leaders' rush toward climate catastrophe. Our hope is not in leaders, but ourselves, as it has been throughout American history. From the Boston Tea Party forward, creative and gutsy public protest has been democracy's best friend.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor. All for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The disastrous impact of climate change has long been defined by class and race. Dr. Cecilia Martinez lays out a necessary vision for a climate agenda that includes racial and economic justice as core goals. And we say hello to Dr. Cecilia Martinez, Executive Director of Earth, Energy, and Democracy. Dr. Cecilia Martinez, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you very much for I'm really happy to be here.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. You have been very involved in an effort called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. And we'll get to some of the specifics of the plan shortly. But first, if you would, give us an overview of the platform.
Sure. The platform is actually one of the first times in this country's history where national environmental organizations and environmental justice organizations and coalitions have come together to write a platform that addresses the climate change for this country. It is a historical document in the sense that for the first time ever, it locates equity and justice as a primary and foundational principle for moving ahead on climate change policy.
Why was it necessary to write this platform?
I think I think we can all agree, given the past events of 2020, that for better or worse, the history of climate policy in this country has not necessarily focused on equity. We have been very concerned, both in terms of policy as well as economics, as well as R&D and technological development, that it is imperative that we deal with climate change and that we reduce greenhouse gases and reduce carbon emissions. However, the strategies that we use to achieve those reductions do have social and economic impacts across communities. We've known that historically. And so I think one of the important reasons that many of our groups came together was to acknowledge that we do have to interject equity and justice in solution building, lest that we create solutions that we will only have to deal with the inequities and the costs on certain communities later. And so to the credit of all our groups, both the mainstream environmental movement as well as the environmental justice movement, we all came together and we did a fantastic job of developing solid principles that could move us towards that direction. Now, mind you, we started this process in 2018. So we did spend quite a bit of time together working through the different pieces of the platform.
Mm-hmm. Now, there have been numerous studies that have shown the way environmental racism actually impacts the quality of life in communities of color. Give us a sense of what we've learned from this research.
Sure. The research has been pretty profound and pretty abundant. It's important to note that there's been a lot of research since the 1980s around where pollution lands in this country, whether it's toxic waste sites, whether it's highways and therefore the pollution from vehicle emissions, whether it's where the most polluting facilities are sited. All of these dimensions have been found to have a racial dimension and an economic dimension. In other words, communities of color, Native communities, and those communities that have lower incomes tend to be the places where all of these facilities are sited and therefore impact the health and well-being of families and communities. I think that the research has been growing over the last several decades. It has given us an abundance of evidence that we need to do things differently from the local level to the state level to the federal level. And research obviously is important. It is based on science, it's based on evidence, it's what we need to develop effective and proper solutions. But research in and of itself is not sufficient as well, in the sense that we know what the harmful impacts are. For example, we know that lead in water and lead pipes are harmful, that lead in paint is harmful, and yet we still continue to have the problem that many of our communities of color, families of color are experiencing lead exposure. So I say that to say we need the research, we need to get better at knowing how pollution acts, where it lands, but we also need to use this evidence to move the political will and the policy will to try and address the situations that we're facing right now.
Now, we don't have time to get into the full platform at the moment. We do want to talk about some of the priorities. The platform calls for an inclusive, just, and pollution-free energy economy. What would it take to make that happen?
I think we're seeing what it will take to make that happen right now. I think if we look at the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Report, which is a 500-plus report that addresses what Congress needs to do to actually address climate change and has a very strong energy component in that report. It outlines exactly what we need. We need to invest. We need to invest in renewable technologies. We need to do more R&D. We also need to do tax incentives and subsidies to the tune of the same kind of incentives and subsidies that have been around historically for a long time for the fossil fuel industry, as well as the nuclear power industry. If as a society, as a country, we invested that much if our government invested the level that they have in the renewable energy industry as they have in the fossil fuel industry, it would go a long way. But beyond that, I think we also need to ensure that the benefits are equitably distributed. So that also is a part of the platform, that we need to move and transition out of economy, but we need to make sure that the people that have been part of the fossil fuel economy are not hurt, that they also have good living wage jobs, that they are not sent backward in this transition, and that we improve the lives of those who have not been able to participate effectively in this economy. The U.S., we spend approximately $1.1 trillion on energy in this country, and it represents close to 6% of our gross domestic product. This is a significant industry that we can use for the benefit of all of our communities.
We're speaking with Dr. Cecilia Martinez, Executive Director, Earth, Energy, and Democracy. The platform also calls for economic diversity and community wealth building. How do these goals intersect with how we respond to climate change?
Yes, and that exactly follows from your last question. If we have, we in this society at this moment in time, we know that energy essentially is a basic right. We can't do anything without the use of energy, from heating our homes to cooking our food, to cooling our homes, to getting us from one place to another. So, energy is what we'd like to believe a basic human right. And in that we need to diversify the institutions and the organizations that actually deliver our energy, particularly as we move into the renewable energy industry. That there are a whole number of models that don't have to rely on centralized corporate economic organizations. Now, that's not to say that we're anti-corporate. Of course not. There are places where we need massive amounts of capital to be able to build that infrastructure. But we are saying is that there can be a diversification of the models so that communities themselves can buy into, can earn, can create wealth in the infrastructure that they're building for themselves. And that's very important, because if we want to distribute that $1.1 trillion that we spent on energy, we want communities not simply to have to pay that out, but to be able to bring that back in. To bring that back in, to be able to access that energy, to be able to hire people in their community to be a part of it. All of those things are wealth building opportunities, which we hope we can move toward.
Now, there's another priority that I'd like to address in the platform, and that is a call for policies that address anti-displacement, relocation, and the right to return. We know that the potential for displacement is enormous, especially right now. What kind of policies can help us prepare?
Yes, well, I think, some of our colleagues on the East Coast and the Southeast and Gulf region have a lot to tell us and a lot of lessons learned about how we can do this. First of all, I think one of the things that we've learned from them is that we need to use, again, a human rights model for understanding displacement and relocation. We know that Hurricanes Katrina, we know that Superstorm Sandy had enormous costs on communities, and that they're still trying to recuperate. Those communities of color and low-income communities have not had the benefits, been able to return to their homes, have not been able to return to their jobs, some of them who have lived in those areas for generations. So I think the policies that we're looking at is to really learn the lessons from our EJ counterparts who have been working in this area, to adopt a human rights framework, and to follow the United Nations framework on displacement and relocation, which guarantees that people should have the right to relocate when and if possible, but more than that, to be able to be a part of the decision making that happens about how relocation happens and how they are able to return or be relocated to different communities. Obviously, we need better policies and better governance around FEMA. We know that there's been inequities even now to this day. Some of those communities have not been able to access very important resources. So we need to both build new policies that guarantee the human rights of these communities, and we also need to revamp and look at existing policies and programs that have not been as effective and equitable as they should be.
Now, the platform is over a year old.
Yes.
What kind of impact is it having within the environmental movement and among those who are making policy?
It's been enormous. I think from the environmental justice side, many of the environmental justice elders were part of the platform, authoring the platform, being involved in its negotiation. And they tell me that we have never been able to get this far in the world in terms of a climate change platform that endorses and builds on equity. So there's been several, I think, successes of this. The fact that some of the major national environmental organizations are now in deep consultation with environmental justice community, trying to work together, not simply follow their own path, but trying to engage us about what are some key policy strategies. And even as policy is being developed, as legislation is being developed, we are constantly being consulted, which has never happened before. And I think that's huge. If you look again at the aforementioned House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Report, the platform, I believe, is cited no less than 16 times. I think they looked at the platform as a framework around which you actually address equity and justice issues when addressing climate change, and have articulated that in the report. So I think we have a firm foundation now from which we can actually get into the specific policies and programs and legislation that can help the platform actually be implemented, that can make the ideas in there come to fruition.
Well, it's wonderful work that you're doing, that you're involved in. Wish you the greatest of success. Dr. Cecilia Martinez, Executive Director at Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dr. Martinez, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press on the most explosive takeaways from Bob Woodward's latest book on the Trump presidency.
Let's look at the issues. Every page of this Woodward book will drive you crazy because Donald Trump is wrong, so unbelievably wrong about so many things. He doesn't have a clue. He says and does so many outrageous things. But 4 areas I find are the most explosive in this book. What Trump has to say about the military, number 1. Number 2, his relationship with foreign dictators and murderers. Number 3, the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic. So let's start with the military. Now, I think it's significant that there are no members of the military quoted directly in this book. But you got to remember that Woodward's book comes out 2 days after the Atlantic magazine reported that Donald Trump, back in the spring of 2017, on a visit to Paris, refused on a rainy day to go out and visit a World War I military cemetery just outside of Paris. He blamed it on the weather at the time. According to the Atlantic magazine, he said he didn't want to go to that cemetery in the first place because it was filled of American soldiers who died in World War I, who lost their lives in combat. And he called them losers and suckers. Trump denies that. 4 anonymous sources are quoted in the Atlantic Magazine report. So the Woodward book again comes out 2 days after that. And 2 days after that same afternoon, Donald Trump went into the White House briefing room and asked about this criticism of the military, said, well, of course, he said, the top people in the Pentagon, I'm quoting now, the top people in the Pentagon don't like me because they want to fight wars so all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else will stay happy. In other words, he's blaming the military for being in favor of starting wars just to please the defense contractors. So then the Woodward book comes out. Again, no direct quotes from members of the military about Donald Trump, but Woodward does report that at the time, Defense Secretary James Mattis, General James Mattis, was so concerned about Donald Trump and his tendency maybe to start a war in North Korea or to start a war in Iran, was so concerned about that Mattis would go to the National Cathedral, went there several times just to pray that things would not get worse, just to pray that Donald Trump would see the light. Woodward reports that General Mattis told the head of the National Intelligence Agency, Dan Coats at the time, quote, there may come a time when we have to take collective action against Donald Trump because he told Dan Coats, quote, that Trump is dangerous and unfit. Mattis continued, quote, this again reported by Bob Woodward, the president has no moral compass. And Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats replied, quote, true. To him, a lie is not a lie. It's just what he thinks. He doesn't know the difference between the truth and a lie. And then the most damning part of the Woodward book when it comes to the military is that Woodward quotes Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor. Navarro told Woodward that Donald Trump once told him, quote, this is Donald Trump speaking, quote, not to mention my generals are a bunch of, they care more about their alliances than they do about trade deals. That's one quote that the White House, by the way, has not denied. So just sort of summing up what we learned from the Woodward book about Donald Trump and the military, Donald Trump often says, I heard him say it again this week, quote, nobody likes the military more than me. The truth is, nobody has badmouthed the military more than Donald Trump. He's got a history of badmouthing the military and a history of taking credit for stuff in the military that he had no business with. We remember, this is the guy who started out getting 5 deferments from service in the military, from having to go to Vietnam, 5 deferments based on bone spurs, which the daughter of the podiatrist who gave him that pass, if you will, those 5 passes, said that her father did this as a favor to Donald Trump's father, his friend Fred Trump. This is the guy who told Howard Stern once that he was proud he didn't go to Vietnam, and his personal Vietnam was having so much sex during the 70s and not getting any STDs. This is the same man who called John McCain a loser, who complained that the Pentagon had, or someone in the White House had ordered that flags be lowered to honor John McCain when he died. Trump didn't like that. This is the same Donald Trump who, according to Phil Rucker and Carol Lenning, and their book, we've interviewed them here on the Bill Press podcast, who told the generals at the Pentagon he would never want to go to war with them because they were so weak. And this is the president who 150 times has claimed and taking credit for the Veterans Choice Act, which allows veterans to go to another doctor if the VA is too backed up to take care of them right away. Actually, Donald Trump had nothing to do with the Veterans Choice Act. It was signed by President Obama in 2014 and authored, by the way, by John McCain. And this is the president who claims that he rebuilt the badly depleted military, when in fact the military budget increased every one of the 8 years under President Obama. So it's no wonder that not one military leader has come out to defend Donald Trump with all these comments about the military, because they know that he is not their friend. They don't trust him. The relationship between Donald Trump and the Pentagon is tense at best. So that's the Woodward book, where it comes to adding, if you will, to information about Donald Trump's relationship with the Pentagon. The second part of the Woodward book that I found pretty stunning was his openness about how much he likes dictators and thugs around the world. This is one of the strangest parts of the behavior of Donald Trump, that people that we once considered our friends, like Angela Merkel and Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron of France, Donald Trump doesn't get along with them, but he's buddy-buddy with Vladimir Putin and Erdogan in Turkey and Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So Woodward asks him about this. The president had 3 meetings, we know, with Kim Jong-un. Did they accomplish anything? Woodward wants to know. He said, you've gotten a lot of criticism that you had these meetings, but nothing happened. And Trump's response basically is, who cares? Here's this exchange. Donald Trump says, so I met. Big fucking deal. It takes me 2 days. I met. I gave up nothing. Well, in fact, Woodward points out that Donald Trump did give up something, several things. He suspended U.S. and South Korea military exercises, which have taken place every year. He did that as a favor to Kim Jong-un. And most importantly, he gave Kim Jong-un the recognition and the global platform and the international stature that Kim Jong-un has always wanted and could never achieve without Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, then Woodward asks, well, what about the fact that North Korea still has their nuclear weapons, didn't stop building nuclear weapons, didn't destroy the weapons they have? So didn't, in fact, Kim Jong-un win that exchange? Doesn't he come out the big winner? Here's Donald Trump's response, again, as reported by Bob Woodward. Quote, he says, it's no big deal. It's really like, somebody that's in love with a home and they just can't sell it. So Donald Trump, the developer, Donald Trump, the real estate executive, comparing it to somebody who's so in love with their home, they don't want to sell it. Kim Jong-un is so in love with his nuclear weapons, he doesn't want to get rid of them, which is very, very far from Donald Trump's promise that he will achieve denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. How did Kim Jong-un pull this off? Bob Woodward reports he did so by flattering Donald Trump. He learned the way to get to Donald Trump is by just laying it on and telling him how great he is. Donald Trump admits to Bob Woodward in the book that he was proud that Kim Jong-un actually called him Your Excellency. Donald Trump loved that. Kim Jong-un wrote Donald Trump a letter after one of the summits where he said he still had a precious memory of their meeting. This is Kim Jong-un, quote, that underscored how deep and special friendship between us will work as a magical force. He laid it on. Donald Trump loved it. He lapped it up. And then he told Bob Woodward about how awestruck he was at meeting Kim Jong-un. In fact, he said to Woodward, quote, "Holy shit." Kim Jong-un he described as far beyond smart. And he tells Woodward, "Kim Jong-un tells me everything, including," he mentioned, Kim Jong-un telling him an account of how he had his uncle killed. Okay, here's a murderer telling Donald Trump all about it, and Donald Trump is impressed by it and likes him even more. So, final question, which Bob Woodward asks, is what's up with this, you and all these dictators? And Donald Trump admits he likes them better than any of the good guys, if you will. Here is Donald Trump about these kind of relationships.
That I get along very well with Erdogan, even though you're not supposed to, because everyone says what a horrible guy. But for me, it works out good. It's funny that the relationships I have, the tougher and meaner they are, the better I get along with them. You'll explain that to me someday, okay? But maybe it's not a bad thing. The easy ones are the ones I maybe don't like as much or don't get along with as much.
So Donald Trump says, explain that to me someday. Okay, I'll explain it before we move on. I'll explain it. He likes them. Why? Because they're the dictator that he not so secretly wants to be. They're ruthless. They're brutal. They operate above the law. In other words, they do whatever they want, which is exactly what Donald Trump tries to do, wants to do, is determined to do as president of the United States. All right, moving on to what I really found the most shocking part of the Bob Woodward book are his comments about the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, even after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, I mean, this happened, of course, these conversations before we knew about Daniel Prude and Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Donald Trump dismissing any importance of the Black Lives Matter movement, dismissing the fact that maybe there's a message there that all Americans should be aware of. This, again, the most troubling part of the book, this amazing exchange between Donald Trump and Bob Woodward. So Bob Woodward asks the president, do you think there is systematic or institutional racism in this country? This is back in June 19, by the way. And Donald Trump says, quote, well, I think there is everywhere. I think probably less here than in most places, or less here than in many places. Woodward, okay, but is it here in a way that it has an impact on people's lives? Trump admits, quote, I think it is, and it's unfortunate, but I think it is. And then this stunning exchange where Bob Woodward wants to know, and I really credit Bob Woodward for raising this point and admitting that Woodward, grew up as a white man with all the advantages that he had in this society, living the privileged life that white people do live in this country. And he asked Trump whether he thinks that life of privilege left him, like it left Bob Woodward, out of touch with the pain and suffering that Black people experience. Here is, again, I think the most troubling exchange in the Bob Woodward book.
Do you have any sense that privilege has isolated and put you in a cave to a certain extent? As it put me, and I think lots of white privileged people, in a cave, and that we have to work our way out of it to understand the anger and the pain particularly Black people feel in this country?
No, you really drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you? Listen to you. Wow. No, I don't feel that at all.
It's hard to believe how clueless, hard to believe how insensitive Donald Trump is to this entire phenomenon of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, which has touched so many Americans and driven so many Americans to say, okay, this is a time when we've got to do something about systemic racism in this country. But not Donald Trump. No, Donald Trump still insists that he has done more for blacks than any other president since Abraham Lincoln, which is ludicrous, which is outrageous. I mean, just mention Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. What's Donald Trump done? But Donald Trump complains that having done so much for blacks, he isn't getting any credit for it. On July 8th, in the book, he tells Bob Woodward, quote, "I've done a tremendous amount for the black community, and honestly, I'm not feeling any love." As to the first African-American president, Barack Obama, Donald Trump says, maybe we should not be surprised to hear this. I still was that he would say it so openly. He tells Bob Woodward, quote, about Barack Obama, quote, "I don't think Obama's smart. I think he's highly overrated. And I don't think he's a great speaker," end quote. And then Trump goes on, he has to do this, to tell Bob Woodward that, by the way, Kim Jong-un thinks Barack Obama's an asshole. Why would he do that? Because I think he is an outright racist. Donald Trump has always been a racist all of his life, starting back to when the Department of Justice sued Donald Trump and his father for refusing to rent apartments to black families in the Queens. This is the same Donald Trump who, of course, led the birther movement, questioning the legitimacy of Barack Obama's presidency for 5 years. The same Donald Trump who praised the white supremacists in Charlottesville, the same Donald Trump who today is running an outright racist campaign, warning Americans that if Joe Biden is elected, the blacks will create and take over America's cities and burn them to the ground and move into the suburbs and burn the suburbs to the ground. Outright racist campaign. And the same Donald Trump who clearly is insanely jealous of Barack Obama, I think because he knows that history will show that Barack Obama was one of our best presidents, and history will show that Donald Trump was our absolute worst.
Bill Press on what he learned from Bob Woodward's latest book, Rage. If you'd like to hear the entire segment, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jim Tankersley, Dr. Cecilia Martinez, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.